Well, thank you very much. And to all of my friends in the Senate, it truly is an honor to be invited to be back with you. Every time I have this opportunity, I'm sure I say this, but it reminds me of the time I served here and how much I wish Washington was like Idaho is. It's like the Idaho Senate. It is truly a breath of fresh air, a recharging of the batteries, and an invigorating opportunity to come and be with you. I'm going to give a few remarks about what's going on in Washington, D.C., and I apologize to you that I'll probably paint a pretty dark picture and leave a dark cloud over your day. But we are facing some really tough times. I suspect it's no surprise to you that I'm going to talk about fiscal policy. Right now, the United States, in my opinion, faces a crisis, a fiscal crisis, that is as great a threat to our nation as we've ever faced. And I seriously mean that. Admiral Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was asked a couple of months ago what he thought the greatest threat to our national security was. And his answer was our national debt. Just about 5 years ago, our national debt was $7 trillion. Today it's approaching $15 trillion, more than doubled. And from that $7 trillion figure, it will double again in the next 5 years. It will triple from the $14 trillion range in the next 10 years if we do nothing about it, if we stay on our current course. And frankly, if you look at it to kind of put that in perspective, our gross debt, and you guys know all this, but I'll quickly go over it. We have what's called debt owed to the public, which is the debt that we owe on the bonds that we sell to whoever will buy them. China mostly these days, although China is starting to get out of the business of buying our bonds because they're starting to worry about the creditworthiness of our bonds. And that's the debt owed to the public. All of you probably in one way or another own some of that, as most Americans do in their pension plans or what have you. The gross debt is the rest of the debt that we owe, meaning primarily adding back in the debt that we owe between government entities. The biggest example of that is the Social Security debt, the debt that we as a United States government and the people of the United States owe to the Social Security Trust Fund for all of the monies we've borrowed out of it over the years. And when you add the total up, our gross debt is about 95% of our gross domestic product. And the reason I go through this is to just give you a little perspective. What does that mean? Well, as many of you probably know, I was a member of the President's Fiscal Commission that analyzed this and came forward with a plan to try to deal with it. And I'll tell a quick little story about that in a minute, about how that came to be. But as we were serving on the Fiscal Commission last year, we had experts from every part of our economy and from every perspective testify to us about what our circumstance in our country is. The unanimous conclusion of all of them was that we face a debt crisis and that it is close. You know, we often talk, I've said this many times, that if we don't change our course, then our children and our grandchildren will pay this very heavy price. It's not our children and our grandchildren anymore. It is us, and it will be here soon. And a couple of the economists who talked to us are experts in sovereign debt, in other words, the debt of nations. They have studied every major economy in the world for the last 200 years and on a number of different factors. But when they compare the debt of economies, of governments, to the gross domestic product of their economies, they've concluded statistically. These economists are not arguing for Keynesian philosophy or any other philosophy of economics. They're just doing the math, doing the statistics. And statistically, no nation in the last 200 years of any significance in terms of their economy has ever reached a point where their gross debt was 90% of their GDP without seeing the economy essentially begin to shrink and reset itself. For all of the obvious reasons. You cannot continue as a nation to carry that kind of debt load. It takes capital out of the marketplace. It restricts the ability of the private sector to grow and expand. And ultimately, it causes the nation to default on its debt. So as we talk to these economists and we talk about this problem that is facing us, it's important to know what it is. What is it that we are talking about? We're talking about us reaching a point. In fact, we asked one of the experts that we were talking to a few weeks ago, what is it that we are talking about? What is it that's going to happen? He had just finished telling us that it's not going to be like getting to the top of a nice economic peak and then just tumbling down the other side. He said it was more like a light switch. It's going to go off in a period of about 24 hours. And so we said, well, what is it that you're talking about here? And he said, essentially, it's the point at which the bond markets of the world determine that the United States government is no longer going to be able to honor its debt. And when that happens, you're going to see a phenomenal impact in our economy. The immediate impact is we won't be able to sell bonds at the interest rates we're selling them for now, and interest rates will skyrocket. Every point of interest adds another $140 billion to our fiscal problem per year. And we'll see interest skyrocket multiple points very rapidly. We will see inflation hit aggressively, a stagflation, which many predict. We will probably see the United States try to monetize its debt, which will dramatically impact and shrink our economy. And we will see the devaluation of the dollar in ways that will impact every American, whether it's in their retirement plan, in their small business, in their personal family budgets, or what have you. And the economic impact will be a very devastating hit to our country, which will last for a long time if we don't take the necessary actions to build our way out of it. So I'm sorry, I said I was going to paint a dark cloud. We face a dark cloud. Now, I also ask every single expert that I talk to, how close is this? Are we a generation or two away from seeing this happen, as we often say when we talk about our kids and our grandkids being the ones who will have to face the music? I haven't talked to one yet who thinks it's more than 5 years away, and many who think it's as close as a couple of years away, which again is the point at which we simply don't have the confidence in the markets to sell our bonds. And ultimately, it starts building on itself. At first, it'll just mean extremely high interest rates. Ultimately, it may result in us not actually being able to find a market for our bonds and having to restructure our debt, similar to what you see Greece facing today and other multiple nations in Europe facing, Japan facing, and others. And the shudder that will send through our economy is something that we must, as a people, avoid. Now, let me go back to the fiscal plan. Quickly, I'll just say, we're debating in Congress right now over whether to shave $61 billion off of our current budget. Our current budget is $3.7 trillion. And I also have to say, I know you guys know this in a relative way, because while Congress has increased its spending in the last 2 years by 24 or 25%, you've reduced yours by about 24 or 25%. What a stark contrast in how to manage your fiscal policy. But as we look right now at the debate going on in Washington, we're talking about trying to cut $61 billion. That's the higher number. The president, I think, is at $6 billion, and the Republicans in the House are at $61 billion. But we're having that fight within the context of a $3.7 trillion budget, and we can't get there. We are in stalemate right now. The perspective that I want to give you on that is the Fiscal Commission, that I'm going to refer to here in just a second, put forward a plan to cut $4 trillion. Now, admittedly, not in 1 year. It was over a 10-year period of time. But the $4 trillion proposal was one that economists said would probably enable us to give the confidence to world markets that we were taking our problem seriously and dealing with it, and allow us to avoid the bond market crisis that will otherwise strike our nation. If you take the $61 billion on an annual basis, it comes out over 10 years to $1 trillion or more probably as you add the interest to it and so forth. But it's a small step, a good step and an important step, but not the whole step that we need to be taking. Another perspective, and then I'll get to the Fiscal Commission and wrap up here. Every day we borrow about $3.8 billion. So if you take the $61 billion figure, which is the upper limit of what we're debating right now in Congress, We get there in a couple of weeks of borrowing. We borrow 40 cents out of every dollar that we spend. And we simply have to change. Now, the Fiscal Commission. The story I was going to tell you is that I have supported a Fiscal Commission for several years now, for 3 or 4 years now. The notion being something like a BRAC commission, a base realignment and closing commission, to have a commission come up with a plan and put it before Congress and require an up or down vote, because Congress just doesn't seem to be able to come together and do it. But in the last year, the focus on the Fiscal Commission on a commission notion tended to focus on not dealing with the spending, and I believe it's the spending, not the taxes. I don't think taxes are too low. I think spending is too high. And the movement in Washington tended to focus on creating a new tax engine to deal with our problems, a VAT tax. And so I quickly retreated from my support of a commission that was intended to help us create another new powerful taxing engine to go along with the income tax and try to solve our problem in that way. And so I voted against it when it was on the floor of the Senate, and it in fact failed on the floor of the Senate. And then the President created the commission himself by executive order. And the way he created it was to put 6 Republicans, 3 senators and 3 House members, and 6 Democrats, 3 senators and 3 House members, and 6 appointees of the President. And I was still dubious about that, because, not trying to be partisan here, but by my math that was 12 Democrats and 6 Republicans. But and then I was asked to serve on the commission after having voted against the idea because of the concerns I had about a VAT tax. But I agreed to serve because the commission was real and it was going to happen, and we needed to participate, and we needed to do it in good faith. And as we went forward, the 6 appointees of the President, for the most part, were not partisan. To his credit, he appointed solid people from the private sector who did not have the politics of the United States at the forefront of their mind, and who instead had the interest of our nation at the forefront of their mind. And they immediately, almost at the front end of the process, took the notion of a VAT tax off the table and helped the commission to move in another direction. So what did we do? And I'm going to conclude with this, just to share with you what the commission did as one idea about how we can approach this. First of all, we said everything has to be on the table. There cannot be any exempted pieces of the budget or of the problem. With regard to Social Security, we took Social Security and dealt with it as a separate entity. Social Security has not contributed to our debt crisis. It is a separate entity, but it is facing a cliff. Pretty much everybody between the ages of about 50 to 60, or under the ages of around 50 to 60 today, is going to see at some point in their lifetime a reduction of their Social Security benefits of about 22% when we hit the wall, if we don't do something now to solve Social Security's pending problems. We took it, set it aside, and made it solvent forever, with what I think were some pretty politically painful but realistic and achievable reforms of the system. Secondly, we took discretionary spending, which is about 30% of the budget, and put caps on it for 10 years, binding caps, achieving about $1.7 trillion of savings there. Third, we took mandatory spending or entitlement spending, and I will tell you, this was, in my opinion, a very weak part of the plan. We did not do nearly enough for the entitlement spending, which you all know is the key core spending portion of the problem. And we put some caps on it and put some other reforms in place that will help us get some savings out of it. I think the savings in entitlement were somewhere around $800 or $900 billion in a 10-year period of time, but not nearly enough. And that was frankly a weakness of the plan, which was the reason that some of the members of the commission ultimately voted against it. And then we looked at the tax code, and we listened to a huge discussion about our tax code. And frankly, as I look at our tax code, if you tried to create a code that was more unfair, more complex, more expensive to comply with, and more anti-competitive to U.S. business interests, you'd be hard-pressed to do it better than our tax code has done it. And I believe that one of the key pieces of this element is tax reform. That was certainly one of the major points that the President's 6 nominees to the Commission were making. And so we did some major reform proposals to the tax code, which would have dramatically simplified the code, reduced the rates, and hopefully stimulated the economy, making more revenue available because of a strengthening of the economy and an improvement of the code. What we did is we basically eliminated all credits and deductions in the code, moving to a flat tax, only it was a 3-tiered flat tax, and the 3 tiers were going from a top rate of 39% down to 23%, a middle rate of 28% down to 14%, and a lower rate from 15% down to 8%. And then we recognized that some of the deductions and credits were probably politically unable to be cut. For example, the mortgage interest deduction, or the charitable deduction, or the deduction of health premiums and retirement contributions. And some of those kinds of, and the earned income tax credit, for example, some of those kinds of deductions or credits we recognized were politically impossible even in our current circumstance to eliminate. So we allowed for those to be built back in, but required that if Congress wanted to build them back in, it had to pay for them by increasing the tax rates back up to cover their cost. And there were different parameters of how you could look at it, and depending on what Congress wanted to do, if it put those back in, your top rate might have gone from 23% to 27%. And your middle rate might have gone from 18 to 20 or from 14 to 18 or something like that. But we put together a proposal to let us get a handle on simplifying our tax code, generating greater revenue, and allocating some of that new revenue to reducing the national debt. We finally had process reforms. You know, Congress is great at just declaring something an emergency and avoiding the budget altogether anyway. And so we put process reforms into place to make sure that we would deal with our problems. That was a $4 trillion package, and it was enough and would be enough to stave off the terrible gloom that I talked to you about at the front end. It wasn't enough to really get us completely set right and on the right course, but it would have given us the breathing space for a decade to do the additional probably $4 trillion of reduction and move forward. The President set up the Commission so that it had to have 18 members. Out of its 18 members, 14 had to vote for the plan in order for it to go before Congress in a BRAC-type vote. We didn't get 14. We got 11. I was one of the 11 who voted for it. And so the Commission report did not get put before Congress for a vote. You've probably heard that there are some of us now who are negotiating with the sort of the template created by the Commission to see if we can't negotiate another plan of that magnitude to put before the Senate. And I'm one of what's been called a gang of 6, 6 senators, 3 Republicans, and 3 Democrats who are now negotiating to see if we can put something of that scope or that type together that we can move forward with. And frankly, we're having some difficulty. One of my colleagues, Kent Conrad, when voting for the Commission report that I just described to you, said, you know, the only thing worse than voting for this Commission report is not voting for this Commission report, because there was something in it that all of us didn't like, and if we didn't do it, we would be condemning America to that course that I just described to you with the bond market solving our problems. One of the President's Commissioner nominees said, if we don't do this or do something, the bond markets will do it for us. And I think that is the most simple explanation about what we must do as a nation. So that's where we are. I don't know if we will get something. It's going to be tough. I do know that we have no real alternative but to get something and get it done and move forward. And so I just conclude by telling you that I'll continue to fight. I really appreciate my friends here in the Senate and my friends in Idaho for standing with me. The vast majority of them have done so with that vote. I can tell you, when you cast a vote that reforms Social Security, that reforms the tax code, that puts a little bit of a handle on entitlement spending and puts discretionary caps on our discretionary spending, you pretty much open yourself up to attacks from every single quarter of the American political spectrum. And I guarantee you that once the report was out, the knives came out as well. And the battle is on in the United States. But I think that's good news. The fact is that we are engaged in fighting for the future of our nation. And I just encourage you to keep doing the right things here in the Senate as you really set the standard for what America ought to be doing in its national fiscal policy. And with that, thank you for indulging me. I know I spoke longer than I should have, but I just so much appreciate being back here with you and sharing with you the kind of fights we're having in Washington, and encouraging you to continue what you're doing here in Idaho, because you are doing what you need to do to prepare and to help our nation prepare to deal with these difficult issues. Thank you very much.